As the US and China move closer and closer to conflict, something unusual is happening in the Southern Hemisphere. Australia, who has counted China as their largest trading partner since 2007, is preparing for war with its largest trading partner since 2007. China. Everyone, today's video is so important because it reveals the truth about how our media shapes public opinion on important world matters. Today's video is sponsored by Mova Globes. Please stay tuned to the end to learn more about one of the most unique products I've ever seen before. Is China really going to start a war with Australia? As crazy as this sounds, just look at these articles that were recently published in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Australia must prepare for the threat of China war. Red alert, war risk exposed. Headlines like this in Western media are an immediate red flag. And no, I'm not talking about this red flag. This should be an alert to everyone about the continuous beating of war drums as Western countries march closer and closer towards conflict with China. I mean, look at the opening sentence from The Age's article. Australia faces the real prospect of a war with China within 3 years that could involve a direct attack on our mainland. Wait a second. Where did the 3 years number even come from and a direct attack on the Australian mainland? It's one of the boldest claims I've ever read in Western journalism, and it makes me wonder. The last time China was involved in any type of international conflict was in 1979 in Vietnam. China has an incredible track record of not starting wars, and in fact, just brokered one of the largest peace deals in Middle Eastern history between Saudi Arabia and Iran, something the US government has never been able to do. In fact, China just actually helped stop a war in Yemen. But despite the evidence showing China's track record of peace, Australians are now more fearful of China than ever before. Look at this article from the Australia Institute. Research shows impact of fear-mongering. Australians more frightened of China than Taiwanese. Right now, 1 in every 10 Australians believe China will invade Australia soon, while only 1 in 20 Taiwanese people believe China will invade Taiwan soon. Let that powerful statistic sink in. More Australians fear being invaded by China than people in Taiwan. There is only one explanation for this insane statistic, and it's the role of media. Alan Beam, the director of the institute which conducted the survey, stated, "The results showed fear-mongering around the risk of war had impacted public opinion." I mean, try this experiment out for yourself. Go to YouTube and look at the 60 Minutes Australia's videos on China. Here you will find a plethora of anti-China videos whose only goal is to instill fear into the minds of Australians. I mean, look at this thumbnail. Put an image of Xi Jinping with his hand raised, throw in some fighter jets, a clever title like Poking the Panda, and you've got a viral video. But what is Australia media really doing to Australian society? Thankfully, there are rational voices speaking out against this, and one of the largest is Australia's former Prime Minister Paul Keating. In response to this outrageous article, Prime Minister Keating said it was the most provocative news presentation of any newspaper he has witnessed in over 50 years of active public life. He called out Peter Harcher, the international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, as a China hawk, but also revealed the true cause of the problem. Australia's foreign policy efforts against China comes from a small group of 5 Australian China experts, all of whom are well-known China hawks and all of whom lack credible China experience. Instead, each member of this group has long identified with the strategic interest of the United States. Just last month, the leaders of Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States came together to announce new details involving the 3-country security pact called AUKUS. The AUKUS security deal represents the most significant, expensive, and geopolitically consequential military efforts in a century as Australia seeks to acquire American and British-built nuclear-powered submarines. But this is where the story truly becomes unbelievable. Australia is a nation of 25 million people, yet this nuclear submarine deal will cost Australia up to $368 billion. I'm glad I'm not a tax-paying citizen of Australia, as I just don't see any way the Australian government could rationally explain how this decision is in the strategic long-term interest of Australian citizens. That's equivalent of each citizen spending $14,720 to pay for nuclear nuclear submarines. You think of eradicating poverty, improving education, providing better housing. There are a plethora of alternative needs the Australian government could allocate this money to and provide real-life tangible benefits for real-life Australians. Instead, the biggest winner of this entire deal is the United States military-industrial complex. But don't take my word for it. Simply listen to another former Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull.
There are billions of dollars going from Australia into the industrial shipbuilding base of both the United States and the United Kingdom. There will be money spent in Australia as well, of course, substantial amounts of money, but there is the big winners here financially are British shipbuilders and American submarine builders.
And once again, Prime Minister Paul Keating describes what this really means for Australia.
The reactor is run by the Americans, the control system is run by the Americans. Our sovereignty is just being peeled away by all this.
But let's just imagine this red alert article from the Sydney Morning Herald is in fact accurate. Don't forget, that article claimed that China would be attacking the Australian mainland within 3 years. How long do you think it would take to build a nuclear-powered submarine? Australia is making this large commitment to the United States, but won't receive their first submarine until the early 2040s. That's nearly 2 decades from now. To bridge the gap until then, the UK and the US will rotate submarines throughout Perth, but honestly, this is where the Australian politicians have missed the mark. Let's just be real. If China is going to militarily get involved in a conflict, the most likely scenario certainly involves Taiwan. But honestly, I can't see one single reason that China could or would even entertain the idea of invading Australia. But did Australia even have much of a choice on the matter? To give you some perspective, let's bring in University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer, who famously predicted the invasion of Ukraine and has been one of the most outspoken American critics of the United States provoking the conflict in Ukraine. Here is the professor describing why the Australian government had to make foreign policy decisions that serve American interests.
Now, some people say there's an alternative. You can go with China. Right? You have a choice here. You can go with China rather than the United States. There's 2 things I'll say about that. Number one, if you go with China, you want to understand you are our enemy. You are then deciding to become an enemy of the United States. Because we're talking about an intense security competition. You're either with us or against us. And if you're trading extensively with China and you're friendly with China, you're undermining the United States in this security competition. You're feeding the beast from our perspective, and that is not going to make us happy. And when we are not happy, you do not want to underestimate how nasty we can be. Right? Just ask Fidel Castro.
Everyone, before I reveal the final truth behind the AUKUS deal, I want to give a huge thank you to MOVA Globes for sponsoring today's important video. As a geopolitical YouTuber, I'm constantly studying world events, and this rotating globe is the perfect tool to help me study the world. Here is what I love about MOVA Globes. Number one, this is a rotating globe that's powered by light. Simply expose it to ambient light and the globe will rotate automatically. Number two, there are no batteries or cords needed. This first of its kind technology is simply powered by magnets. There are over 40 designs including world maps, outer space, and even famous artworks. These globes would make an incredible addition to any office, and in fact, I'm going to be using my MOVA globe as a prop in my future YouTube videos. I have a space for it right over there. Save 10% off 6 and 8.5 inch MOVA globes using the code CYRUS at movaglobes.com. I'll also drop you a link in the description below. Now, despite everything I've said, I still think there is a potential for Australia and China to forge a better relationship in the future. Don't forget, China and Australia's relationship looked completely finished just a couple of years ago, but things have actually started to turn around. Under the previous Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison's reign, there was no high-level contact between China and Australia for nearly 5 years. But now under a new Australian government, the current Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, and Trade Minister have all met with their Chinese counterparts in recent months. As with every relationship, whether it's with your spouse or between two high-level governments, communication is always key. Improving dialogue and encouraging engagement is the key to getting around differences and forging a pathway of cooperation and learning to work together. Here is one statistic I want you to remember. Out of the 25 million Australians, over 1.3 million of them are Chinese, representing 5.5% of the entire population. In this article from Australia's ABC News, we learn most Chinese Australians see Beijing as an economic partner rather than a threat. More than 60% of Chinese Australians also thought it was highly unlikely that China would pose a military threat to Australia over the next 2 decades, and more than 70% saw Beijing as more of an economic partner than security threat. The personal bond between Chinese Australians and China is real and something that can't be ignored, and perhaps the best clue into how the Australian government can better educate their population, since the majority of non-Chinese Australians are so fearful of China. But to really drive home my point and how ridiculous this deal is for Australia, let me share with you one scene from one of the greatest political sketches I've ever seen that will help you understand just how ridiculous the AUKUS decision truly is.
I'll come straight to the point. This white paper is recommending we spend close to $400 billion over the forward estimates. Now, at some point, the PM is going to be asked a very simple question. In order to protect us from which enemy?
It's so hard to say.
400 billion, pick one.
A regional player.
Specifically, Colonel.
An Indo-Pacific regional player.
More specifically?
Indo-Asia Pacific.
That's broader. Who are you leaving out? Europe? Yeah, I sort of need a country.
Or an unaligned player.
No, a country.
One that might threaten us. Just one.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to raise tensions.
Where?
In this room.
You know what? I'll name one and you just nod. China. Yeah, okay. And what exactly are we protecting?
Strategic interests.
Specifically, Colonel.
Indo-Pacific strategic
Again,
interests.
Brigadier, really specifically.
Indo-Asia Pacific strategic
You know what?
interests.
I'll say it and then you nod. Our trade routes. Yeah. And who is our number one trading partner?
Shall we use the nod system?
Sure. China? Yeah. So under this scenario, we're spending close to $30 billion a year to protect our trade with China from China. And that doesn't strike anyone at this table as odd?
I'll end today's video with one final article that's worth mentioning. This is from the East Asian Forum and is entitled "Australia's China Illiteracy Has Dangerous Consequences." The article's main point is that seeing China only through a security lens is not in Australia's national interest. This bilateral relationship is more than just national security. It must be built upon a foundation of mutual understanding. This does not mean that Australians must agree with the Chinese government. Rather, having deep knowledge of China's history would help Australia to counter some of the false narratives from the Chinese government. Having a narrow security lens can lead to a serious problem of groupthink. If you only have a hammer, then you tend to see all problems as nails. The government may instinctively reach for security solutions when there are alternative options available. Those who put in the effort to explain to the public why certain developments occur in China or the motivations of the Chinese government are sometimes accused of being China apologists or siding with the enemy. And this represents the real problem behind the rising tensions with China. Being a China hawk is easy. It's the popular thing to do, but fighting for a better relationship and most importantly, finding a way to work together is truly the only pathway forward. And most certainly the goal of this YouTube channel. We only have one world to live in, so let's find a peaceful way to coexist on this tiny planet. Once again, thank you to Mova Globes for sponsoring today's video, and make sure you use my code and claim 10% off your order today. Thank you everyone for spending time with me here today on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.